Hello, everybody. It's good to see you today. It's time for that Saturday briefing I try to do every week, and it's sure good to be back in my office. As you can tell by the background, I can see the window there. You would think it's snow out there, but it's really not. It's a beautiful day. It's supposed to be up in the mid 80s or even higher today, so spring has sprung. Yay. It is May Day, May the 1st. We had a little boy from the neighborhood came to the door and had a little bucket that he had made with a little pipe stem for the handle and a little bucket. His mom and helped him, and they're very creative like that, and had some candy in there, so that was pretty neat. But anyway, so we're in Bismarck today on May the 1st, and as I record this, it's good to be local for the weekend. We will be traveling about 2.5 hours in the morning. We'll get up a little early and head out, and got an appointment, but we'll be in Newtown. That's what we're looking forward to, being there with Sister Gunn, Pastor Gunn. So anyway, let me jump into today's lesson. I have a good lesson. Then I have some announcements at the end for our friends and prayer partners and supporters. If you don't want to listen to that, I understand, so I'll put it at the end. I do have an introduction. Got a new couple that's come in from South America, joined our ministerial team, so I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I want to start to do something today that I have a little file that I keep that I call I Predict. And I just, things that I think I can see coming in the next 5 to 10 years or even further. I just, it's a leader's responsibility. Leaders create the future for their organization. Okay, they have to be like Issachar and discern the times, and in light of what's going on, and they think trajectory, they have to kind of create a better future for their organization. Managers manage the present, and then followers just show up and experience the present that has been created for them by leaders and managed for them by managers. And of course, we as pastors, we have to be both leader and manager a lot of times, and so but you always should be thinking ahead. Like right now, as I am watching, it has nothing necessarily to do with church. Well, it does, because everything, as my old friend John Wilson said, every decision is a spiritual decision. And so the major car companies, for example, they are all by 2050, that's just 30 years from now, they are predicting that they will be 100% electric cars. Well, that's going to have huge ramifications for a lot of people. Then it'll take a while for internal combustion enemies, that's what some people think of them as, engines, to be phased out. But that's going to have a huge impact on people's employment, a lot of companies, because those electric cars are basically just computers on wheels. And so as you think about that at church, we have special parking places right now. Well, we'll probably have to have some special parking places in the future for cars that need to, during church, recharge their batteries. So you should always be thinking about these kind of things. And so I have a file that I call I Predict. And so today I'm going to give you volume 1 with my Saturday briefing, something that I predict in the reasonably near future. If not right now, it's something that should be on your radar. And so let's jump into the lesson. Back in the 50s and 60s, when I was a boy in ministry, the big churches, the churches that would have more than a pastor, most often when you thought about kind of getting started, your first entry into full-time or vocational ministry was what we would call an associate or assistant pastor. Excuse me. And so the associate or assistant pastor basically was a repeat of what the pastor did. The pastor's main job at that time was to be a preacher and to be a priest, to take care of a parish, to shepherd a parish or a congregation or a community. And so that was the main responsibilities of a pastor in those days, to preach and to take care of his people. The visitation was huge, knocking on doors. You lived in a small community a lot of time, or a local community in a large city or out in the country. And so you had certain people were loyal to a particular denomination and a particular church. And so there wasn't this thing of of trying to grow your church so much. It's just you took care of the people in your church. And if you grew, it's because if you were Presbyterian, Presbyterians moved into the community. If you were Church of God, whatever. And so back in the 50s and 60s, when associate pastor, assistant pastor was what churches had. And then the day came, by the time I started the ministry in the 70s, it was just, at least in the Church of God, it was just getting started. But we began, the happening churches were churches that would hire a youth pastor. My first job was a youth pastor. I didn't really have a job description. They didn't know what to do with me. Basically, I was like a youth camp counselor. They expected me to have activities. There really wasn't a big focus on teaching or preaching. It was taking care, chaperoning, taking care, having something to do for the young people all the time. And I did teach a youth class, but there's very little parameters. And then it got more and more specialized, and being a youth pastor really became a respected profession. Then the next wave is that the really happening churches begin to really covet or really desire, covet's not a good spiritual term, is it? They desired to have ministers of music. And that was the thing in the big churches, the happening churches. The premier position was ministers of music, and so they began to really train up our young ministers to come to go into minister of music, and that was a highly valued position. Then, as the churches and our world got more and more complex, and the responsibilities, our people still think that we just preach and pastor, but we all know that there's a lot of administration. There's incredible responsibilities and complexities. Even on a small town pastor, there's all kinds of administration. That's usually the gun that shoots us in the foot, our lack of attention to detail. And so there's a lot of churches begin to hire an administrative pastor or an executive pastor. And then the next wave was children's pastors, and maybe even a little bit before that was worship leaders. More so than choir directors or ministers of music, they became really glorified worship leaders. And a lot of this had because of the people we were targeting. And so choirs became passe, and then choirs began to pass away. In very few churches, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but very few churches have choirs now, and we look more at a great musician that can sing. We call them worship leaders, and they'll build us a team, and that's very important to have worship leaders. And then along came children's pastors. And I'd say that's kind of where we are right now. Maybe the most valuable players in our churches is having a good worship leader and a good children's pastor. And of course, we want to have somebody that can administrate and then to be a youth pastor and to visitation, all of this at every level. The people have these expectations, and so. But I'd say right now, maybe the top positions, the most desirable positions are children's pastors, are worship leaders, are, here's the next one, got a whole new major for this. And people are becoming, they're in big demand, and that is media pastors. See, it never stops. People that know how to do media, how to do Facebook, the COVID-19 brought that to reality for all of us. Social media and websites and Facebook Live or YouTube channels and lights and putting stuff up on screens and so all of this is coming at pastors. And so now we've moved from associate pastor or assistant pastor to youth pastors to minister of music to administrative pastors, to worship leaders, to children's pastors, to media pastors. When will it stop? Well, I predict that there's at least one more. And I predict that in the very near future, the most valuable player on a church team that people are going to really leaders are going to want to hire or have in a strategic lay position, I predict, you ready? I believe that the happening churches are going to be the churches that have a strong and thriving senior adult ministry. I've been watching this for some time, And I believe that's where we're heading. I believe that the pastors that are thinking this way will get ahead of this issue. They're going to be the churches that are going to be the thriving, fruitful, influential churches. Think about it. Hang with me. Senior adult pastor, senior adult ministry. And I make a prediction out of that. They'll probably not be called a senior adult pastor, because senior adults, because of the baggage that comes with it, senior adults don't like to be referred to as senior adults. Okay? And they don't want to be the golden whatever, or all these crazy sappy titles that are given sometimes. And so, but think about it. Americans are living longer than they've ever lived since the flood, and they're more healthy. They're living later, they're living into their later years more than any other generation. They're more affluent, they're more active, they're more engaged in life than any previous generation. Their expectations are vastly different than their parents and their grandparents. People in their 60s that may be retiring, but they're not living a retiring life. The word retirement, if it's even used, takes on an entirely different meaning for people in their late 60s and even 70s. According to the AARP, American Association of Retired People, on average, every day in the United States of America, 10,000 people are turning 65. Every day. They go on to say that the number of older adults will more than double over the next several decades. They're going to be doubling. And so that means, for instance, 10,000 people a day, that's 3.650 million people per year. And I did a little math here. That's the entire population of the Dakotas and Montana, plus an additional million people joining the senior adult ranks every year. And this is going to be going on for decades. 3.650 million people are going to be joining the rank of 65 and older every year. So think about it. If senior adults are living longer, they're in better health than they've ever been, and they're leading, and they're becoming one of the leading, if not the leading, and growing demographic in your community. They have more free time, more money than any other demographic alive today. On average, the people that we would call senior adults are the wealthiest people in your church and in your community. Moreover, the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of mankind is happening right now and will continue to happen. And that is, all the men that are senior adults are dying and leaving the bulk of their wealth to their widow. And so it's going to be like the women that followed Jesus around and financed his ministry. There's going to be these, potentially in your church, these dedicated, honorable women. Maybe their husbands were not as spiritual as they should be. They didn't believe in tithing or didn't practice tithing. They may not have been a church-going man, but their godly widows are going to be some of the most influential and affluent people in America. And so I predict that the pastors that are ahead of this and are prepared for this are going to be in the best position to have a thriving, dynamic, cutting-edge church. I predict that this is going to redefine the architect of our church. Think about how the architect of the church has been redefined because of the refocus of our ministry. When churches, even in the 50s and 60s, they were designed to glorify God. Again, I'm not making a value statement here, but the ancient temples and all this stuff, they were designed, the big cathedrals, and you go through Europe and even here in America, and you go in town, even the little town, you have just regular houses, but you have this huge cathedral, this beautiful church. They were designed to glorify God. Whether that was the best use of the money or not, I'll let you decide that. But then when we begin to target, we begin to design our buildings to appeal to the people that we were approaching, and the lights and the screens and all of the media and very unchurchy looking buildings, because we were trying to reach unchurched people, and that was the approach. So we allowed that focus to define our architect. The ministries of the church. Think about the ministries of the church. For me, like when my last pastor, we made a major investment in Christian education and children, in particular children. We built a center for discipleship, is what we called it, and it had a state of the art children's worship center. We had a big playground on the inside so they could play, not so they could play in the winter, so they could play in the summer in South Carolina when it's 100 degrees and 100% humidity. So we had this. So we made this major investment because of the focus of our ministries. Okay, and then the message of the church. I believe this is going to have a huge impact in the message of our church. Not that we'll change our message, but we'll change the application as we begin to take into consideration this group of people that is ever growing and ever exerting influence in our church. And so that's kind of my prediction. But now let me take a little rabbit trail here. Honestly, I think it's sad that it's come to this. The original intent of the church was to minister to all ages. Specialization is only a recent phenomenon. There was a time that churches didn't even think about specialization. You had a family church. And of course, you had special activities for children and teenagers and young adults and the seniors and everybody. But they didn't think about specialization. And then we get this specialist, and they would take our children off by themselves. They stopped seeing their parents and their grandparents worshiping. They stopped hearing the pastors preach. And then children were over here doing their thing. And we became more and more fragmented. That's not how the early church operated. Think about the first controversy in the early church. It had to do with senior adult ministry. It was, how are we going to take care of our senior adults? Now we're coming around 100%. You never hear churches really putting a big focus on senior adult ministry. That was the very first focus. Think about who the first youth pastors and the first children's pastors were. The first young couples classes were taught by the senior adults, by the older women, by the older men. They taught the younger how to live, how to act. And we've gotten so far from that. And here's the irony of it. The irony of it is that more and more churches are going after a smaller and smaller demographics. It's like we've gotten fixated. And again, God love them. We love young couples with families, with children, and we love them. But it's like we've gotten fixated on it. And the very people who have less time, who have less disposable income, and who on average, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but the statistics back me up on this, who on average do not have the same reverence for God and dedication to the church. And so we're focusing on them, and we're forgetting this ever-growing population that is more affluent, smarter than we give them credit for. And then, by the way, if we want to reach the young families, who are the best people to get a young couple in church? Who's the best people to get children in church? It's a young couple's parents and grandparents that will get them and their grandchildren in church. And so I predict, brothers and sisters, that the thriving churches, the happening churches, are going to be are churches that have as a major part of their focus the older members of their congregation. Now, what to do now? Okay, in light of this, creating the future, creating a better future for your church. What to do now? Drinking some hot tea to protect my voice here. It's kind of getting into hay fever season here in Bismarck. Other parts of the country, you're kind of coming out of it almost. But what to do now? For you personally, Pastor, personally redig the well of honoring our elders. This is a subject for another lesson that I'm going to have, but I believe that the reason our nation is in the predicament that it is in is that we've forgotten how to honor. We tear down statues and desecrate buildings, and we no longer respect authority. We don't know how to honor anything, and all honor comes down from God. And so we've lost contact with honoring the institutions that reflect God, and on and down it goes, and honoring the very people that reflect God, and that's our elders. And so I would ask you, Pastor, to go back and redig the well. Isaac had to go back and redig his father's wells. That's the analogy I'm using. And go back and redig the well of you personally, how you honor the elderly in your church. Then I encourage you, Pastor, to go and work out a biblical theology of aging well. What does retirement mean? John Huntsman Sr., who was a very moral, cutting-edge, ethical business leader back in the day. He died a few years back. But in his book, Winners Never Cheat, he wrote, philanthropy, or philanthropy. Oh, Jesus, I can't say these words. Philanthropy ought to be the preeminent ingredient in everyone's recipe for material gain. In other words, living a life of giving. And he was a billionaire, and he gave well over almost $2 billion at the report that I looked. He had already given away almost $2 billion for philanthropy. What a word. But it's giving. Well, let me ask you, what should be the recipe for those blessed with many years? The answer is a philanthropic life. Not going out and just, okay, I've worked hard all my life, and now I'm going to spend the next 20, 25, 30 years of my life just having pleasure, doing what I want to do. No, I've been seeing this day come. I would speak into my senior adult's life, and or people that were going to be a senior adult in a few years, or I would put, this is the definition of success, is to work and handle your finances so that you'll reach a point where you can work for the church, and both locally and abroad, for free. And that's living a philanthropic life. And that's biblical theology. That we die with our boots on. That we at the end of our life, the last thing we do, if God gives us health and gives us our faculties, is the last thing we're doing something to magnify, make bigger the glory of God and advance His purposes in all the earth. And so work out a biblical theology of aging well and begin to teach your people. Begin to teach your senior high schoolers what the trajectory of their life will be, to be able to handle your finances so that one day you can work for God and the church for free as a volunteer, as a vocational amateur, somebody that does what they do for the joy of it. Then number 3, begin grooming senior adults or rising senior adults in your church by raising the bar for your seniors. Let them know up front that they should be the most active people in the church. They've got more time. They've got more resources. They've got more energy. They forgot how much energy it takes to take care of little children. And so they should begin to raise the bar. Don't turn senior adult ministry into a potluck supper. It should be something that's far more than that. Your senior adults should be the most active children's and youth workers, the maintenance help, the secretaries. We had precious ladies that would come in and volunteer hours a week in our church and did meaningful ministry right there in the office. Your next secretary or your first secretary, treat it like a real job, because it is. Could be a retired person, a man or a woman. And so begin grooming them to work for free, to give of themselves, to give their best, their talents, their abilities. and to do the work of evangelist or whatever. And then Paul told Timothy, you have to do the work of an evangelist. You're not called to be an evangelist, but sometimes somebody has to do it. They do the work of cutting the grass. They do the work of maintenance. They do the work of getting the bulletin out on time. They do the work of coming and opening and closing the church. And on it goes. There's just, every pastor has a list that long of things that has to be done every day and every week and every month. So begin to groom your senior adults and your rising senior adults for this. The fourth thing, affirm and honor the elderly you have now in your church on a regular basis for their sake and for the people around them, because you're wanting to teach them. Address their concerns in preaching in your ministries and in your sermons. Next, find ways to make them feel celebrated, not tolerated. A lot of those not coming back. I've been asking around, a lot are our senior adults, and the excuse is they're frightened for their health. I see the senior adults out everywhere else. I've talked to a couple senior, and this is anecdotal, but I've talked to a couple senior adults. Not Church of God, thankfully, but just walking around town. When we go shopping, I'll just talk to people. I try to strike up a conversation when I'm out and about, and they're not going back to church because, well, they didn't act like they cared about us anyway. And so, there's a world of difference between people being tolerated and people being celebrated. And then the last thing, making my bold prediction that the happening churches in the next few years are going to be the churches that put a big focus on senior adult ministry. Well, the last thing I want to encourage you to do is don't do what we've done for every other MVP staff member. Don't overdo it. Don't make our church, we're going to come in and now we're going to stop doing that and we're going to start focusing on senior adult ministry. No, you focus on the church family. You focus on your community. You take a look at your community. What does your community look like? That's what your church should look like. If you are in a college town where the majority of the people in your church is a block away from a college, well, your church will probably look a lot younger than, say, a church that's in an older part of town. If your community is a community where people are moving away and all the young people are moving away, which does happen, then your church will look older. And so, but if your church is predominantly one ethnic group, well, then that's probably what predominantly your church should look like. If your church is in a community that has a broad mix of ages and ethnicities and college and young and all this stuff, well, then make your church, don't get fixated on the really cool churches or the really growing churches. They focus on this one demographic. God so loved the world, and whatever the world looks like in your community, then find a way to reach them and minister to them. Be a father to the young, be a son to the older, be a mother to the young, and be a daughter to the older. Learn to live and give and receive and work together as a family. Be a family church. Celebrate all expressions of humanity. So in closing, I heard just recently a preacher remark, when I look out over my congregation and I get so depressed, for all I see is a bunch of little old blue-haired ladies. Well, here's my suggestion to that young man. I want to remind him that blue is beautiful and powerful, and the future belongs to little blue-haired old ladies. You better deal with it and celebrate it. You'll be far ahead in achieving and finishing the Great Commission in our lifetime. So there's my little pep talk, and I'm going to talk to the region for just a moment, and if you need to sign off, feel free to do so. God bless you. Thank you for your prayers and your support of the North Central region. But now, to the pastors and ministers of the region on our Saturday briefing, I want to introduce to you, and I'm going to put it, this is a good time for me to remind you of a couple of Facebook pages that we have. It's called NCRCOG, Credentialed Ministers page. I'll put their picture on it there. And then the North Central Region Church of God Executive Offices. That's a mouthful. It's almost like philanthropy. There you go. All right. That's a mouthful, but those are 2 pages. I'll put their picture up there. And if you don't follow those, follow both of those. I'm constantly, and I know Pastor Chris is, and Sister Jessica and my wife, we're constantly putting things on there. And so it kind of keep you up to date. But I want to welcome, yesterday I had lunch, Mark and Katie Voigt, our pastor there in Botno and Dunseith. I think the official name is Turtle Mountain Church of God. And they have 2 congregations that come under that moniker. And the church there in Botno, and then the church there in Dunseith. And so this couple is coming to be the associate pastor under their leadership in Dunseith. And it's a young couple. David is, I think, 26 or 27, and Priscilla is 22, and they've been married less than 2 years, and they're from Chile, sometimes we gringos may call it, but it's from Chile, South America. This is their first visit. I think David maybe has traveled a little bit, but they have moved to our region, to North Dakota, almost to Canada. And I met them yesterday, and I'll have a picture there on our Facebook page. And I just welcomed them. And David, I added you to the mailing list. And so God bless you. Welcome. It's an amazing thing to think you guys took the plunge and moved all the way to the other side of the world. They're on the other hemisphere, and up to the other side of the world. Down there, the water runs counterclockwise. It's entirely in our summer, it's their winter, and their winter is our summer. So it's on the other side of the world. And so David and Priscilla Espinoza, I think is how you say it, Espinoza. We're so glad that you have joined us, and I congratulate you, Pastor Mark, and Pastorette Katie. What a great choice it looks like you've made, and I wish you the very best. Also include the May regional prayer calendar, and so that'll be available for you today. And then the ongoing regional calendar, 11 days as of right now, 11 days to the Montana camp meeting. Looking forward, guys and gals out in Montana, seeing you there. Talked a little bit about that last week, so I won't belabor the point. But anyway, things are beginning to move. Summer's coming. And so I'm looking forward to being out and about and seeing a lot more of you a lot more frequently than we get to in this huge region that we're privileged, this beautiful country that we're privileged to live and minister. All right, that's about it. Love you guys. Let's keep running to win. I'll see you around the bend. Bye-bye.